Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alex Turner from thebusinessdesk.com, and I'll take you through this final session of today. This session's on the water industry. It's called Filling the Pipeline for Sustainability in the Water Sector. We'd love you to get involved in the conversation. So do put any comments, thoughts, questions for the panel into the chat window, and I'll look to weave those in as we go along. And I'm sure our panel will be able to answer any questions you have. We have a distinguished quartet with us this afternoon. We have Nigel Codman, who's the director of the York-based business Novaloo. Nikki Roach, the president of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Tom Williams is dialing in from India, where he's the director for Nature, Action and Water for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And we have Gordon Rogers, who's head of long-term strategy at United Utilities, and until very recently was head of sustainability at Yorkshire Water. So welcome all, and thank you for joining us. If I could just ask you to just briefly introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your role in the water industry. Nikki, if I could start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So I wear two hats, really. One is that I'm president of, as Alex said, president of CIWEM, which is a huge honour. And CIWEM, if you don't know, are an international professional institution. We've got members in almost 90 countries, actually, around the world, in the water and environmental sector. We're a really broad church, and that's why I love CIWEM, I think, really. And aside from CIWEM, I'm a director of Axia Origin. We're a fairly unconventional management consultancy, and I've got sort of 20 years experience in the water sector, so I kind of bring all that to bear, really. And I'm really interested in reducing our demand for water, both individually and organisationally. So I guess that's kind of hopefully what we'll get onto a little bit this afternoon. So it's nice to be here.
Great, thank you. Nigel?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Also very pleased to be here, thank you. I head up a business called Novaloo. As the term suggests, it's about new toilets. We are constantly surprised by how much water gets flushed down the toilets, even worse, and particularly for someone like Tom over in India. Of course, it's fresh water that gets flushed down them. We have tried, of course, grey water harvesting, and to some limited success. These toilets are very simple. They use 1.5 litres every flush. And so when you look in commercial terms at average water flush of about 9 litres, we're saving about 7.5 litres per flush. And with places like universities coming back, schools, even places like local authorities now are also starting to look to this, because also, surprisingly, out of this last year's pandemic, we have found out that one of the greatest things that people like about these is the fact that they're incredibly hygienic. You cannot flush them with the lid open. And as everybody will now know, if you flush the lid with the toilet with the lid open, as of course we men tend to do more than the ladies, then all sorts of nasty things fly up into the air and stick to the walls, and we stop that.
Great.
So I'm here really to just try and help people understand that there are very simple ways to step off on the way of saving water.
And I'm going to note that down as the first practical tip of the session. Tom, over to you.
Great, thanks, Alex, and hi, everyone. So my name is Tom Williams, Director for Nature, Action and Water at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We are a membership organisation, so we have about 200 multinational companies who all embrace sustainability within their governance and their business models. Some familiar names, including Shell, Unilever, P&G, that you'll all be familiar with, are our members. Now, we work on water, I guess, in 3 domains. So in the agricultural value chains, I think, as people will be aware, that agriculture accounts for a large proportion of water use globally. Secondly, in industrial settings, so that could be manufacturing, but also for energy. And increasingly, and linked to what Nigel was talking about, we're looking at water use in the homes, particularly with some of our member companies like P&G and Unilever, which have brands that require water use in the home, shampoos, detergents, for example. So how can we actually drive consumer behaviour change for those kinds of companies? So really looking forward to today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And over to you, Gordon.
Thanks, Alex, and afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I've just moved roles really, but I've also got 20 and something years in the water industry to join Nikki. We used to work together in Yorkshire Water, in fact, many moons ago. But I spent 20 years in sustainability at Yorkshire Water until just a few months ago. And then I've recently moved across the Pennines in a working sense, at least, if not literally, still based in Leeds, working for United Utilities. So particularly focused on environmental sustainability and the impacts and the benefits of a water supply company, but equally pushing into the social and financial sustainability and making sure all three are in balance, ideally, and trying to encourage that.
Great. And Gordon, could you start off by providing a bit of context around the scale of the challenge with water efficiency?
Yeah, I've got a few statistics maybe to prick the interest of the audience and start off our discussion. And I guess the world of water is perhaps quite hidden from a lot of people. And certainly in the UK, we take water services largely for granted, and touch wood, very few people have problems with their services on a very regular day-to-day basis. Unlike in India, perhaps, might be interesting to contrast that with Tom in a second. But generally a very hidden service in Yorkshire and the UK, which we're blessed with after 150 years of investment, of course, but under increasing pressure from all sorts of things. So a few statistics just to bring a few themes to life that hopefully we can unpick through our discussion this afternoon. So I guess the key challenge with water is to make sure we match supply and demand wherever we are in the world, and that there is enough to meet all the varying needs of water. But of course, climate change is really compounding that and disrupting fundamentally the water systems that we rely on and are very used to. So a few stats just to bring that to life here in Yorkshire, as we're focused on that this afternoon. So there are national projections in the UK, some of the best projections in the world for climate change, called UK CP18. They were just updated a couple of years ago. And so if we think forward just a few decades to 2050, some of the statistics are that we should expect along our coast, and if we think about the marine water environment, 30 centimetres of sea level rise along our coast. And if you're based in somewhere like Hull, which is already below sea level, you can imagine just how important 30 centimetres might be. That's already a strategic risk, the biggest flood risk outside of London in Hull. So there's one dimension, and that's growing through to perhaps 70 centimetres of sea rise expected by the end of the century, which is quite enormous for our coastline. Equally, we've had enough extreme flooding events and heavy rainfall events that have resulted in flooding here in Yorkshire over recent years, a real big driver across the north of England, as in many other places. We should expect a 20% increase because of climate change in the short, sharp rainfall events that really kind of cause the peaks in our system that the sewer systems were simply never designed for, and our increasingly urbanised systems cause all the flash flooding and so on, which results in flooding of our homes and businesses and disrupting our lifestyles, which we've seen plenty of in recent years. And it does feel like climate change is here and now. I kind of sit in my home office window these days, and I've noticed just in the last few days some really quite surprisingly turning from sunshine to really stark downfalls, and then 20 minutes later it's gone. So that kind of more steady environment just seems to fundamentally have gone. And then on the drought side of things, equally, I think we probably think we're blessed with water, and it's green and lush, God's own county and all of that. But actually, there are so many increasing pressures on water. And I guess another statistic alongside the water ones, broadly 1 million people expected in Yorkshire over the next 25 years. So that's about a 20% population growth over the next 25 years in Yorkshire. That water demand has to come from somewhere. And yet on the flip side, with climate change, kind of the mid-range scenarios in the summer are that we should expect about 18% or so less water. In some of the more extreme projections, that's even more stark and quite frighteningly so. But I think the stat that particularly pricks my interest with for this kind of debate, by 2050 in Yorkshire, we should expect that every other year is going to have the hot, dry summer that we experienced in 2018. And we just, certainly on the water utility side, I can tell you how stretching an experience like 2018 summers really are to maintain that supply-demand balance. And then if we think it global, I don't know whether Tom's got any additions here, but take it globally, it's not just thinking about the water that comes out of our tap or how we flush the toilet and our local water environment. We insource and consume a lot of water in every single product that we buy. And so you'll be quite gobsmacked. I find these stats gobsmacking anyway. Our classic cup of Costa coffee typically has 140 litres of water in one cup. So the water that you're kind of seeing and drinking and experiencing actually, if you think about the water that's grown in the coffee beans, in the transport and distribution, in the manufacture of the cup and the cleanup of the cup, 140 times or more the water footprint of what you might expect. I won't even give you the stark footprints for a pair of jeans or your steak. Really quite frightening statistics about how much water is hidden in these things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is water is a really rich and complex debate, and really connects everything. There's carbon in water, there's water stress, there's pollution, flooding, availability. There's so many dimensions that we could pick on over the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, but there's a flavour of what we're talking about.
No, thank you, Gordon. We certainly loop back round to the Yorkshire elements of the discussion shortly. But Tom, if we could start with the big picture and the global challenge. What is the scale of the problem, and how do we get people to understand that, particularly people like in the UK where we don't have droughts, the water always comes out the tap. How do we get people to understand that it is a critical problem?
Yeah, good question, Alex and Gordon. You sort of introed these points quite nicely. I mean, if we take a zoom out to the global level, we have billions of people in the world who don't have access to safe drinking water supplies and adequate sanitation. 80% of all wastewater is discharged directly into the environment without being treated. That pollutes fresh water. It causes climate change impacts as well. And we've got huge inefficiencies in how we use water. So every country suffers either from too little, too much, or too dirty water. And some countries suffer from all of those three things. So it's truly a global problem. It disproportionately affects poor countries and poor people. Generally speaking, if you have the money, you can spend your way out of these challenges. Now, how do we connect this to people for them to understand the issue? And I think Gordon started to address some of it there. It's about connecting water to food, to energy, to lifestyle goods. Everyday choices and decisions will likely have water implications. If we look at the building sector, for example, globally, it's responsible for about 40% of the global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. Water usage in the home is responsible for about 16% of energy in the home. So if you start to reduce your energy use in the home, you're going to get lower energy bills, and you're also going to be contributing to mitigating climate change. So when you start expanding the water discourse to include food, to include energy, to include lifestyle choices, I think that's when you start to really address people's relationship with water. And that becomes an entry point that you can educate, and you can really make them sort of stakeholders and agents of change.
And Nikki, is that a role for industry bodies like yours to take on, to educate businesses and individuals?
It's a really interesting point. If we were all in a room, I'd have interrupted about 100 times now, so you should be grateful that we're not. To a degree, that's absolutely, CIWEM's membership is typically professionals working in the sector, so arguably we should be the people that are articulating this to people who are not that interested. I've been going through a bit of a light bulb moment around this, though, personally recently, because for me it's always been about, I'm geekily interested in this stuff. Look at my wallpaper, of course I'm interested in this stuff. And it felt like, how do we get everybody else on board? And actually I was challenged by somebody at DEFRA recently who made me think whether we do need to educate people, or whether we just need to make it really easy for people. Because for all of the people that we will take with us, and we will take some of those people with us, and that's great, there are lots of people for whom this is not a priority, and it will never be a priority. And so I suppose what I'm now rethinking is, so what does that mean in terms of, is it behaviour change, or is it that we bake stuff into policy or to standards, or we design things out, or we have a mandatory water label, which hopefully is coming here in the UK in the next year or two, so that, so we design it out at source rather than needing to ask people to make conscious choices. And that's not me trying to swerve that, flipping heck, I'm trying to build a low carbon, low water footprint home at the moment, but it's really hard. And so I suppose for me, it's kind of thinking about, how do we architect an environment where it's really easy for people, so that if they don't want to think about it, through just making better choices. The products that are lower energy, lower water footprint are better products, so they'd want them anyway, rather than needing people to have to think, do I make an eco choice, which means it's a slightly crappier shower, or it's slightly, you know what I mean? How do we get them to think, I want that because it's better, and also it's better for the environment? Because I just think otherwise we're asking too much of people, I think, probably at this point. So maybe controversial, but yeah.
I was talking to Richard Walker, the managing director of Iceland Foods, last week. He's written a great book, The Green Grocer, but he was making the point about it isn't just about labelling or trying to direct people to the right choices. You know, people have to make the choice based on cost a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So it's how do you deliver a product that is the same cost as what they used to buy, but delivers the environmental benefits as well. And I guess that requires real innovation. And Nigel, what your company's doing it is that, isn't it? It's an innovation. It's trying to design a solution that people can just forget about, but is delivering an impact every time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is, Alex, and it's interesting. A couple of things that the guys have said. Gordon, you mentioned Hull, and of course we know that Hull, as you say rightly, is about a foot below the level of the sea, and so there's always problems, but there's also equally problems that I get when you were back at Yorkshire Water. You pumped an awful lot of water over there. Because there wasn't as much captured over there. So it's where the water is and where it falls. And that's become even a more practical problem as the rainfall type has changed dramatically, as we've all just discussed. We know, for example, more in the international field that Tom was talking about, that one of our partners who is selling these products out and fitting them out in South Africa, I think it's 2017. They had in Cape Town a major problem where they literally went on 50 litres, I think it was, Gordon, of water per household. Now, we know that looking further back, it wasn't that long ago that sort of target of water saving was being thrown at other places. Thames Water were being tasked to put in 1 million homes in the northwest of London, and they were said, well, the only way they can put them in is if they only use 50 litres of water, which at that time was never ever going to happen. But that was the only way it could happen from an infrastructure point of view. There wasn't enough water to go in them, and so I think last year we've had this increase in water usage, hands washing, and that's not going to go away. And that's, that alongside all the other things people have mentioned, that's 25% more use of water, according to Water UK.
I think one of the interesting things, both in that Cape Town example, and I think Melbourne went through something similar, was how it suddenly becomes a public education piece, and actually everyone then understands how many litres they use in the shower, how many litres they use when they're flushing the toilet, washing their hands, how much they use cooking, and actually there's that bit whereby individuals measuring it, they're able to reduce it because it's much more conscious. Is that a route that either we might go down or should go down? Does anyone think? Gordon, you're nodding along.
I'll start my view. I'm sure the others have a view too. So when you're working in the water utility, this is on the agenda and has been for a long time. And it's kind of how fast can we push? So I think a few things I'll throw into the conversation at this point. We have a discussion in the water sector about whether we should treat people as customers or as citizens. And kind of customers on that, kind of more in the space that Nikki and Nigel were getting out there. You make it easy for them. They just want. 10 years ago, we were quite happy to be a hidden sector. The kind of the success was if we didn't interrupt anybody, we didn't flood anybody's cellar, we didn't cause a pollution incident, that was success. We were completely hidden. Nobody would ever need to think about us. That was great. Whereas I think today, actually 10, 20 years on, we're in a quite different space of we're never going to get to the solutions that we need to if we're hidden. And actually, we need to move people. Yeah, of course, we want great customer service and we want to keep improving all of those things. And absolutely, we should lead as hard and as fast into that. And I think that's the quickest route out of this. But I think the only sustainable way out of this is behavioural change and society at large waking up to the challenges that are facing us, which I think are fundamental I hate to think of the people that are going to be here at the end of this century and what planet they're living on and the way we're currently going. So unless we face into that with true behavioural change and systemic change, and fundamentally, we don't need to Nigel's point, we do not need to use, as we currently do, 140 litres per head per day in Yorkshire. If we wanted to, we could transform that, and there are plenty of examples around the world where people live on much less. And frankly, water is cheap in the UK is the bottom line. I don't mean that in a commercial sense as a utility operator trying to push the price up. I think we simply don't value it. Yeah. And paying about a third of your energy bill is your water bill, typically on average for a domestic home. It's fundamentally misunderstanding the value and the necessity of water. And it's much more the operational cost and the energy and chemicals and the infrastructure that needs to go into getting water out of the ground and into your home and then back out in a sewer system, rather than the environmental damage, the societal necessity of all of that. And I think until we can truly engage people as citizens, reconnecting with their water environment, understanding where water comes from and by extension where food comes from, energy comes from, and goes to when you flush the loo and all of those kind of things, I think we have to go hard into that behavioural change. And it's not something kind of we do naturally in the UK. We've got we quite like the nanny state, don't we? And it looks after us and all sorts of things, and it's there as the full, and kind of the water sector is an extension of that, I think. So I wonder, and there's no easy answer to this, the utilities have been trying, the innovators like Nigel's business have been trying, how do we make it really mainstream, really easy to face into some of these things and push it onto the agenda? And I think, to your point, Alex, metering, smart metering is one of those things. And we're a bit behind the curve, I would argue, in the water sector on that environment. Again, because we're not really willing to accept the investment that's needed in that at the societal level. We are not really talking. There's a few nice pilot studies and good examples of cutting edge stuff. Some here in Yorkshire, one in Sheffield, really cutting edge, trying to get a really granular understanding of the network, be able to monitor it in real time and address things, reduce down leakage even further, all those kind of things. But I think we're a bit behind the energy sector, for example, and their smart meter rollout. We haven't talked to the water sector and the energy sector about what joint smart metering might look like and really showing that compound effect. So I think there are lots of needs and opportunities in this space that we just need to go at so much more harder than we are. But we have to recognise the value of water services much more deeply than we currently do, in my view.
So that begs me to ask a question of us all, really, at the heart of this, which is how do we get that into the sort of consumers and the business owners of this world to understand that it's as important as the big energy, the carbon fight that they've all signed up to and agreed, but it's just as important. How do we do that?
I mean, one thought is a national target. You know, we don't talk about water in any way. It's interesting. I'm not trying to be controversial with you, Gordon, at all, but I think I'm absolutely with you, and I wish we could take people down that curve. But I've had a few conversations with one or two people in DEFRA recently, and I'm not sure there's the political will or appetite at the moment in the UK. So, I mean, if you could wave a magic wand, it would be compulsory metering for everybody straight away. And then we suddenly know, not necessarily charging, but metering. So we just know what's being used. And then actually the water companies will have a better handle on what actually is leakage and what's demand. Because if you talk to Thames, they'll tell you that since they banged about 800,000 smart meters in the ground, and it revolutionised the way they saw patterns of demand, because they suddenly understood people using water entirely differently in some areas to the way they expected it. So I think if you could meter, that would be brilliant. But I think it'd be interesting actually to ask the audience their thoughts on metering, because I think there's a general view from government that people don't want meters. And I'm not sure on the back of COVID and, the whole kind of Extinction Rebellion climate conversations that we've really started having in the mainstream now over the last few years, whether that is still true. And if you said you could have a water meter, but you wouldn't necessarily have your bill linked to it, whether people would be as anti-water metering. It'd be interesting to know in India, Tom, it's a different landscape, obviously, but what the metering view is there. Because I think to start off with, knowing how much water we use in our homes is, like, I know what my per capita consumption is because my water bill came through the door at the weekend, and I'm a geek and I worked it out, and I was horrified because I've got one of these water reusing toilets, and I'm bothered about this stuff, and it was 110 litres. I thought I should be better than that, but I wouldn't expect anyone normally to know what their PCC is, but if you've got a smart meter for energy, you'll probably know what your energy consumption is. So why wouldn't we do that for water? I think getting it live in people's homes is a challenge, but you know, we're going to get to 85% meter penetration by 2040. I don't think it's fast enough, personally. Yeah.
Tom, what's your perspective on this debate?
Well, maybe just to respond on sort of the India context, and I guess you've got two extremes here. On one extreme, you've got lots of people who just don't have regular access to water. They have intermittent supplies. The quality can't be assured. So quantity is an everyday concern for them, not how much they're using, but how little they're actually getting. And on the other end of the spectrum, like I live in quite a modern society with apartment buildings, which is completely self-reliant. By regulation, they have to have their own water systems set up. Some of them also have their own reuse systems. So toilet water can be recycled for toilet water use over and over again. So you're not using good quality toilet water. And it makes India a really interesting test bed for some of these innovations, because you do have entrepreneurs, SMEs in this space. You do have some supportive local government regulations because it's a water stressed country. They're trying to do as many things as possible to alleviate that. So it's an interesting test bed for these kinds of technological innovations, but also policy and governance innovations as well.
Just on that point about what's driving the innovation, is it mostly happening in places where there's an acute problem, or are people able to innovate on cost or aiming at the environmental consumer? What's making the biggest difference at the moment, do we think?
In the UK or globally as well?
Either.
Well, I'll give the UK version and certainly the Yorkshire version, and others build on this, please. But I think it's a number of drivers. So I think we have recognised in the water sector right up to government level kind of the resilience challenges that are really facing the sector over the long term, and a fundamental need to relook at the whole water system for the long term to ensure that we can supply demand way into the future against all those pressures that I outlined. So innovation within that sense is kind of at the heart of how do we, one, drive water efficiency. So there's a huge focus on leakage, and we've absolutely rightly been escalating the ambition on leakage. And again, to be slightly controversial, I would say we need to go much further and faster. And it'd be interesting to compare some of Tom's leakage rates in his counter in India with some here in Yorkshire. And I guess because we got Victorian systems originally, that's when a lot of the infrastructure started in the UK. It needs an awful lot of modernisation probably to get to the same standard that Tom's block is in, albeit a completely different thing, of course, outside of his block, I suspect. But so there's a kind of fundamental need there to drive that resilience agenda. And then equally, as part of that resilience actually is recognising just how fundamentally we rely on the environment. Quite literally, it is natural capital in action, isn't it? Water being a natural capital product, relying on it, depending on how clean and available it is, depending on how we manage the landscape around us and those kind of things. So very much deploying that, and therefore recognising we need to innovate in that space and treat and value that part of the business as much as just thinking of it as a more traditional kind of readily available commodity, as it were, perhaps is where we were in past times. So I think innovation is one of the buzzwords in the water sector for exactly that reason, because we think it is the solution. And I totally agree with Nikki and Nigel's points that the more we can do that and just make it easy, both for the businesses, business customers and domestic customers, has to take us an awful long way. So that there are all sorts of great examples and much more to do. But I guess what we have on the table at the moment does not get us to where we need to be in 2050 or 2100. So there's a huge gap for innovation, for behaviour change, for policy change, for customer engagement. For me, it is such a systemic, fundamental concern. If you take the super long view, everything needs to be on the table from my perspective.
And maybe just to build on that, Gordon, I mean, I've never worked in the UK water industry. So as an observer of the UK water industry over the years, now if you think back to 1989 and privatisation and big institutional governance shake-up of water, the primary purpose of that was to drive private sector investment to improve water quality. And it achieved that quite quickly and quite effectively. But now there's a different set of challenges in the UK, all to do with resilience and those things that Gordon mentioned. And I would argue that the current institutional setup, the policy, the governance structures are not fit for purpose for today's challenges. They were set up and designed for 1989 issues. They served that purpose well. And what I've observed since then is sort of these bolt-ons to the whole regulatory and institutional setup. Instead of saying, well, if we had a clean slate, how would we build this institutional setup, the governance and the policy to deal with the resilience challenges we face today? So I think if you don't have that right enabling environment in place, then innovation is going to be slow and it's not going to have the impact it could have.
Would you mind if I built on that, Tom? Sorry, you may well want to respond. I don't want to steal the opportunity to do that, but I think it's really interesting from the point you raised. For me, I am really, President, I'm getting loads of feedback. I'm so sorry if that's me, forgive me. My presidential theme is everything is connected. Like, I'm really interested in thinking about things in a much more, like in an environmental systems way to begin with, as well as connecting people. I know that the Environment Bill, which is legislation coming out in the UK fairly soon, is really pushing for that systems-based approach and looking at some of the really interesting comments that have been coming through, as a few people talked about the wastewater side of things and the environmental impact. And for me, I think we do have to look at this in a much more joined up way. It's great we've got the innovation fund coming in for Ofwat, but actually water companies are currently incentivized to a set of metrics that encourage slightly more siloed thinking. You've got a leakage target. You've got, it's great that we have those targets, but the challenge is if we don't have something that encourages us to lift our eyes up, then the risk is that we're so focused on, I don't work for a water company, by the way, but so focused as a sector on driving for hitting a leakage number that we're not really thinking about the unintended consequences of that. And I think, as much as we should be talking about metering and reducing our demand for water, we should also be talking about slowing the flow and attenuating that and stopping us putting fake grass everywhere, which is terrible for biodiversity and does nothing to slow the flow of rainwater. I hate fake grass. Take it out if you've got it. But genuinely, how do we slow the flow down so that our foul water, our combined systems are not overloaded, so that we don't end up with quite as many pollution incidents in our rivers? So for me, it's that kind of, how do we incentivize our systems and institutions to really think at that systemic level? And if you lift it up a level beyond that, how do we think about the energy and water sectors collaboratively? Somebody was saying to me the other day, desalination, a byproduct of desal is hydrogen. And we're pushing for hydrogen production. So we'd never go for desal normally because it's a really energy intensive process. But if the net carbon impact is better because you're creating hydrogen as a byproduct, then actually you might choose to invest in desal. But that's kind of National Infrastructure Commission level, isn't it, where we're thinking about that level of planning. And I think we do need a paradigm shift, as you've suggested, Tom. Whether it needs to be the institutions change or whether it's just the way that we look at the problem that needs to change, I don't know. But yeah, here endeth. Nikki gets off her soapbox. Sorry, Alex.
No, and something said links to a question that David Carr's put in.
I'll talk about all of that. Thanks, Reggie. Sorry.
No, fire away, Nigel.
I was just going to say that there's been quite a number of sort of undercurrents of education in what we've talked about, which is quite understandable, I think. And in particular, I think we're looking at educating the end consumer. You mentioned it, Gordon, I think, right at the start. And we've got two, they seem silly examples. But I mean, for example, one person we were talking, I think Nikki was talking there about controlling flow. And some people put a valve in that controlled the flow to the taps in their washrooms. They were really pleased and said, oh, can't we put that on the toilets? Well, yes, but they'd take 10 minutes to fill because you've still got to put 9 litres in. You're reducing the amount. And then we had someone else who said, oh, but I've changed the amount of water I use because I put this huge plastic duck inside the cistern. I have noticed that the maintenance team are complaining that they're a bit more difficult to clean. Well, that's because it was designed to have that amount of water flushing it. It's a lack of knowledge, I think, in end consumers about all of these areas that maybe we have got to address and start to pass up to places like Water UK and other bodies.
That's great, no, good point. I was just going to ask, well, David Carr's question. He said, given supply-demand issues, are the plans to increase catchment in the next 25 years, or is it all about driving down demand? Gordon, if I point that in your direction.
Thank you. Quite clear steer and prioritisation right across the sector that we want to reduce demand as the first port of call. And so, speaking with my ex-Yorkshire Water hat on, all the focus really in the kind of next 5-year period is all about leakage reduction and water efficiency measures with customers, and absolutely rightly so. And that's through a thorough cost value assessment, and it comes out as clearly the best thing in the next 5 years. If we need to bring on supply options, of course, there are those in the north of England if we really have to get to them. But back to that discussion, we're currently 140 litres per head per day, and we really don't need to be. So I hope that will continue moving out where water efficiency keeps pushing it. I think if you had that same discussion in the southeast and Anglian region, for example, is super dry. If you compare their climate to some parts of Europe, you'd be quite surprised. And they've therefore been kind of at the forefront of this, I guess, for the UK water sector, really pushing the water efficiency agenda, really trying some innovative things with their customers, really pushing on leakage very hard. I think their water resource plan would show they're feeling, unless innovation shifts again somehow for us, they're kind of at the lower end of that, and they have to start thinking about demand supply side options as well as demand reduction options. So again, I think if I take the long view, and if I look through to mid-century, end of century, I think all of these options are on the table. We need to keep pushing the innovation and the efficiency and the behaviour change kind of agenda. And I totally agree with Nikki's point that it isn't on the political agenda, particularly is it as a priority. It's not fundamentally broken in that sense, like we see on net zero, for example. And I think we need to start seeing it in that light. Of course, if the UK can't manage its water supply situation and make itself meet, then God help the rest of the world, because we've got water and money. So of course we can do this. It's all practical. It's just, how do we plan our way through that? What is our ambition? That systems change that Tom and Nikki were touching on, I think really comes to the heart of all this. And perhaps we are a bit, I take Tom's challenge really, perhaps we are still a bit in 1989. And we need to think much more fundamentally about 2050 and 2100 and systemic change that might be needed. I'm less interested personally in changing the organisation names and hats. It's the same people doing the same thing. So I think that's a bit of a distraction personally. I think we just need to change our incentives and our ambition and our policy around it. And actually, there's thousands of good people in the water industry across the UK that are desperately trying to work at these things and can go as fast as we want to support them.
I think a really instructive country in all of this is Australia, and I think Nigel mentioned the drought earlier. So they had something called the Millennium Drought, which really made them rethink, across their whole water system what they needed to do. And part of that response, particularly to this demand supply issue, was to have a portfolio approach. So you have a portfolio of demand management solutions, of supply solutions, desalination, resource augmentation, and reuse. And that reuse piece is quite interesting because at the moment in Australia, that reuse piece hasn't really developed in the last 15 or 20 years. So they've initiated sort of a national dialogue around wastewater reuse because there's this so-called yuck factor that people are not interested in reusing wastewater, whether it's for potable, so drinking water purposes, or non-potable purposes. And that might be an issue that could be interesting to explore in UK, specifically around reuse, and have a real citizen dialogue around the need for reuse, what some of the challenges are, the perceptions are, because I think that's a really important part of the portfolio that they need to consider in the UK.
I mean, if I could build on that, Tom, I think there's an interesting kind of planning angle there as well. So actually a lot of new build development now, the standard is 110 litres, for example, and actually how do we incentivize developers? How do we make sure that where new social housing is being built, where housing is being built large scale, I guess is the point, it doesn't matter the type of housing or the demographics, but how do we ensure that new infrastructure is all automatically thinking about those things? And I think Nigel touched on the point earlier on about affordability, or perhaps it was Alex, but it's got to be the most affordable option, not the least affordable. And I think at the moment, I mentioned earlier on, I'm trying to do a little renovation project and create a home that's low water, low carbon, and it's not easy and it's not cheap. And I'm in the sector and I'm finding it difficult. So how do we make it really, really easy for people to think about water reuse, whether that's just grey water for flushing loos, whether it's going the whole hog and thinking about it for potable? I just don't think I mean, speaking from personal experience, I'm having to talk to industry experts and consultants who've offered to have a chat with me about this kind of stuff. That's not, that's insider knowledge. That's not easy if you're not here. And actually, how on earth can we expect small businesses or individuals to be able to do this kind of stuff? We've got a job as a sector to be talking about these kind of things. And I would challenge actually that's partly the water sector's, there's an opportunity for the water sector there, even though it's not their responsibility to implement the solutions, but to create an environment where the dialogue can be happening and businesses can be thinking about it and individuals can be thinking about it. So
there's also incentives to think about. Now, before I moved to India, I lived in the Netherlands for a number of years, and the mortgage I had in the Netherlands, you could get a reduction on your interest rate if your home was energy efficient. 0.01%, whatever it was, but could make a difference. Imagine if you had the same for water conservation in your home. So there are lots of different incentives we can think about that consumers don't even need to think about making that choice, right? Because they're going to be saving money, and in the long term, it's going to be cost effective because whatever it costs to make it a water efficient building, they're going to get back in 3, 4, 5 years.
And somebody's asked on the questions about is there kind of, should we have watermarks? I like it, nice pun. And that is almost definitely coming in the UK through the Environment Bill. So the intention is that there will be water labels. So in the same way when you buy a washing machine, if it's A rated for energy, you'll know what the water rating is. And there's a view that actually, I can't remember the stat, sorry, I'm not Gordon, but I think it's around sort of 10 to 15% worth of savings they expect from a water consumption perspective will come on the back of just mandatory water labelling, and that people will start to make more conscious decisions. And then you bolt that into the planning regs. So then new builds can only be built with appliances that have got more efficient standards. So I think you're absolutely right, Tom. It's got to be this portfolio approach, hasn't it? It's got to be, we can't just rely on behaviour change, but we also can't just rely on market forces. I think it's got to be a bit of everything, really.
And what are some of the trade-offs that we all need to consider to accelerate progress? What are the things that we'd rather not do, but really should be doing that would make a difference? Gordon, you were smirking along.
Well, I feel I'm being the negative one and really challenging the sector that I work within, but hopefully in a constructive way. I guess I come back to fundamentally, I think water is cheap in the UK. And to that whole point of where Nikki was going, I guess if you have a cost choice, and of course we as consumers and citizens individually, of course most of us, unless we're very passionate like Nikki and probably us on this call, actually, we might pay slightly more for the eco-friendly option or whatever. But of course, most people wouldn't even think about that, and should they have to? I think the incentives should be there for businesses as much as they should for the water companies, as they should for water consumers and the bill payer. All of that kind of needs to line up, doesn't it? But I wonder whether we could look innovatively at the tariffing of what we pay for water and who pays for it how. Effectively, at the moment, it's all fairly universal and flat, and there's a standard rate, and we get it as cheap as possible for everyone, which, of course, I can absolutely get at one level. But I wonder how you could use that as the ultimate incentive. Human beings, we respond to financial incentives, don't we, at every level? And I wonder whether we could use that, perhaps even as far as give everyone the basic level of water for absolutely nothing. That's just a social given that you need this level of water. UK could afford that, couldn't it? But if you're really wasteful and you want to fill a private Olympic swimming pool, then I think you should pay through the nose for that. I don't know. I think that's an interesting discussion on whether the metering and innovation side of things could really help us be quite innovative and move things on from 1989, to Tom's point, into a modern, driven way of looking at that kind of thing.
I'm completely in agreement, Gordon. And the argument I always hear back is twofold. One is you need metering to be able to do that. You really need to, everybody needs to be using, and I think that's a fair point. And the other is, and I'm less convinced by this argument, and this is not because I am not attuned to vulnerable customers. I'm absolutely attuned to vulnerable customers, but there's a challenge around there will be vulnerable customers, and there'll be reasons why some people are high users. But I think once you understand what people's consumption patterns are, and they're all customers, then water companies are reasonably good actually at social tariffs and about dealing with that. I think the challenge at the moment is it's a bit of a black hole. If you're only at sort of 55% metering, that's 45% of your customers your domestic customers, I think it's important to make the point, not business customers. You've got no idea what they're using. You can't help them, can't do anything with them at all. And Thames will tell you, actually, from their smart meter data, a good proportion of customers are using way less than 140. And that's the other thing, is it may not be, to come to your point, Alex, that people have got to make really hard decisions, because for a lot of people, they're fine, actually. I suppose it's just trying to shine a light on that, because at the moment, obviously, if everyone can use less, brilliant. But it's not that everybody's at 140. It's that we don't really know what everyone's at in the UK.
And I think technology, to that point, can help us get really hyper-local, can't it? And really understand, as you say, lots of people probably really quite efficient without even knowing it. Probably the converse, lots of people are really inefficient without even knowing it. So I think the technology and that focus could really take us an awful long way.
I just think, appropriate pricing, as Gordon and Nikki have mentioned, I think is critical to this. The challenge is that no politician wins votes by saying, I'm going to make you pay more for water. No consumer wants to pay more for water. So you have to sort of frame it within a value of water discussion. So if you can have a discussion around the multiple values of water, then you can actually further that pricing discussion a lot more than just having it as a cost issue. I think, again, it's about a dialogue. It's having a dialogue with citizens and other stakeholders about these kinds of aspects. And as soon as you get an understanding of the value of water, then you can move on to pricing.
And if I can just add one thing, sorry, do you know the one challenge, I think, is the leakage thing. So I think, and I can say this because I don't work for a water company anymore, but I know how hard water companies push to hit leakage targets. But I also know that the consumer perception of water companies and leakage is they don't give a toss. They let, look how much you leak and you're asking me to save water. And I think we've got to be grown up and have a much more nuanced conversation about that, because it can't just be, well, I'm not going to bother because you're not bothering. And a water company sort of thinking, oh, I can't push too hard here because, oh, maybe they're right. I think we've got to be a bit more grown up about leakage is not perfect by any stretch, but also we don't really know what's going on some of the network. Bluntly, they're playing a bit blind. So I think you're right, Tom. We have to have that value conversation, but we have to have a mature value conversation. And I think there's a bit of there's a bit of a fear factor about whether we're ready to have that or not yet.
Well, I think that'd be a good discussion for another day. I mean, unfortunately, I think we've just about run out of time for this afternoon. That's flown by, and I found that fascinating. I'm certainly going to be going to check my water bill and work out my personal usage, as well as keep an eye out for any fake grass that might be around. So
I'm really affected by that. I'm sorry.
So I'd like to thank you all very much, Nikki, Nigel, Tom, and appreciate your contributions and joining us this afternoon for our discussion on water. And actually, this is the final session of the day, so it also falls to me to wrap up the entire day session. I think we've had lots of great discussions and insights since we opened up with the Minister for Climate Change, Lord Callanan, at 9:30 this morning. I hope you're ending the day feeling better informed and, more importantly, inspired to make a difference both in your own circumstances and in your businesses and organisations. Thank you very much for joining us today. We've had more than 400 people on the platform across today, which has been fantastic and shows, I think, the enthusiasm to learn more and to improve on where we are currently in Yorkshire. I'd like to thank all our session chairs and all our speakers for their contributions, and in particular to thank our sponsors, Squire Patton Boggs, Music Magpie, Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, EV3 Power, Harworth, Mott MacDonald and Audley for their support with this event over the last few weeks and months. Thank you again for attending. I hope you found it really useful. We'd love to hear your feedback, so do get in touch with us. I think a survey will be going out to in the next 24 hours or so, and we look forward to seeing you at our next In the Circle event, which is focused on the Northwest region on June the 30th. So it'd be great to either see you or if you can share that with your colleagues, and be great if they could join us on June the 30th. Thank you very much.